driving force behind the drafting of what's called the preparatory schema, the plan in preparation for putting it together. This group, this preparatory commission, took suggestions and different schemas and plans from all sorts of people, put them all together, looked at them, and then produced one schema, one plan, and that's what gets presented. This draft document, the draft document on the liturgy, is the one that was to eventually be placed before the council, before the Second Vatican Council, for the fathers of the council to discuss. It was referred to by some as the Bonini schema, by his admirers actually, and was accepted as the document, the schema, that was produced by the Liturgical Preparatory Commission. That vote was taken on January 13th, 1962. It was his document. They had all these documents. His document, no surprise there, he was the head of the commission. His document is the one that comes out of this commission as, here are our suggested changes to the Mass. The Liturgy Constitution, which the Council Fathers eventually voted on, was substantially identical to Bonini's draft schema. Now, it should be noted that there were substantial misgivings about the plan from the beginning, but for reasons that we can never really seem to know, and all of these different authors never seem to really nail it down, and it seems to be lost to history, or we just don't know. But for whatever reason, Bonini was able to overcome whatever opposition he had, and he had a lot of opposition to his plan. In either case, whatever happens, on December 4th, 1963, as we've noted, the Second Vatican Council adopts and approves Bonini's plan for changes to the Mass. So what were Bonini's thoughts about the changes in the Mass? His own thoughts, him personally? We must strip from our Catholic prayers and from the Catholic liturgy everything which can be the shadow of a stumbling block for our separated brethren, that is, for the Protestants. This is the guy who formed the new Mass. Now that quote is extremely telling. He gave it to Osservatore Romano, the Vatican newspaper, in 1965. Now the question's been out there all this time if Bonini was actually concerned with making the Mass more Protestant-friendly, or whether he was just using that as a cover for a Freemason plan to actually destroy the Mass. Now, we don't really think the answer to that's ever going to be known. As we said, he himself denied that he was a Freemason right up to his death. But whatever his motives, and like we said, there's no way to know what his intention was. One thing is absolutely certain. This one man set out on a course to so alter the Catholic Mass that at the very least it would lose practically any dimension whatsoever of being authentic Catholic worship. He said it himself. Strip away everything that's Catholic to make it more Protestant-friendly. A very, very close associate of him, as a matter of fact, his secretary, said of his former boss, he accepted and embraced secularism because he said it was reality, and it was necessary to accept reality. He held to the modern philosophical view that man is made without God. This is an archbishop. That man is made without God and does not need God. That was made by his secretary, Abbot Boniface Lux, speaking about him in an Inside the Vatican interview not so many years ago. As to the curious question of whether he was a Freemason bent on destroying the Mass, a serious issue, some series of events happened which really started to feed this understanding or this suspicion. Very shortly after his schema is adopted by the Preparatory Commission, Bonini was suddenly removed as the secretary to that same commission and lost his professorship at the Lateran University in the same case. That happened in early 1962, very shortly after his schema is adopted by the Preparatory Commission. Because of who he was and what he was doing, nobody really believes that these moves could have been made without the knowledge and probably the consent and permission of John the 23rd. Most likely his consent. So stripped of his power, it looks like in early 1962 that Bonini just has sort of moved off the stage, he's lost all of his authority. However, not very shortly after that, John the 23rd dies, Pope Paul VI is elected, and he appoints Bonini as secretary of the official body to implement the changes to the Mass that Bonini himself has guided through the Preparatory Commission 2 years earlier. So in 1964, 2 years after being canned, He became the secretary of the Commission for the Implementation of the Constitution on the Liturgy. That's big, large Roman speak for a body referred to as the Concilium. Now, no one seems to know why he'd been dismissed by one pope and almost immediately reappointed by another. In either case, he was now in a very powerful position to push through the very plan that he had written himself 2 years earlier. Now, a word real quickly about Pope Paul VI here. According to our sources who had direct contact and access to Pope Paul VI and had private audiences with him with no one else in attendance except them and the Holy Father, Pope Paul was sort of a weak-willed man. This is not talking about his holiness. It's not talking about his intentions. This is talking about his constitution. He was a weak-willed man who they believed was easily manipulated. He totally supported the idea of getting rid of the Tridentine Mass, the traditional Latin Mass, from the outset. He wanted it gone. And it was only some very strange quirk that actually kept him from totally eliminating it. When word began circulating that he was about to totally abrogate the Tridentine Mass, to totally blow it up, a number of prominent Catholics wrote a personal letter to him asking him not to do so. According to reports, it was the presence of Agatha Christie's name on the list of people who'd signed the letter that he said, he sort of jumped out and was like, Agatha Christie? And so for the sake of the Catholics, most of them English, Catholics on this letter, he did not totally abrogate the Mass. So the Mass was never done away with. For those of you who've sat in parishes, people here in the TV studio audience or people sitting at home watching this, the traditional Latin Mass, the Tridentine Mass, was never abrogated. That's a point you hear constantly. We won't do that old Mass anymore. That old Mass was never abrogated. So, he was also heavily influenced by the French philosopher Jacques Maritain, who was a well-renowned Thomist philosopher, but also had some sort of decidedly leftist thoughts when it came to social teachings. When Dietrich von Hildebrand made a personal appeal to Pope Paul to beware of the changes of the Mass, and I have to share this with you, we got this information we're telling you right now directly from the mouth of Alice von Hildebrand herself. She said her husband Dietrich went to Paul VI when all of this was happening and said this is going to destroy the faith, that this is horrible. It's going to wreck the faith of Catholics. That the theology of the Mass has been gone and substituted with something else. When he told Paul VI that, Paul angrily dismissed him and told him, and he and his concerns, just be quiet. That's right from the mouth of Alice von Hildebrand. She said it really, really greatly disturbed Dietrich. And that's when his writings changed. A lot of the stuff before that was very philosophical-oriented, wonderful, deep, beautiful things that Pope Pius XII referred to him as a doctor of the church, called him the doctor of love. He's a wonderful, wonderful man, great deep thinker. But when all of this started happening to the Mass, you see a big shift in his writings. And he starts writing different books over here like the Trojan Horse and the City of God. And he starts talking about what's going on inside the church now. And that becomes a shifting point, a change for him. So the big picture we have here is somewhat mysterious. A priest, Annibale Bugnini, with a decidedly reform-minded agenda. Some would say, because he's a Freemason, that he wanted to destroy the Mass. He gets his plan adopted by the council that he is secretary for. Shortly afterwards, he loses all his authority. Shortly after that, and then his plan gets accepted by the Second Vatican Council. Shortly after that, John the 23rd dies. Pope Paul VI comes in, reappoints him, and puts him in charge of the committee to implement and interpret the very plan he wrote 2 years earlier. That's how this whole thing swims through. Suddenly, bishops and lay people become alarmed at what they see going on. They appeal to the Pope. They're dismissed. And in the meantime, a new Mass is being engineered that almost totally downplays all Catholic worship in favor of a Protestant-friendly approach. That's what was going on in the church in Rome. Now, this is an extremely important point, and I need to stress this. No one, certainly not us, no one is saying that the new Mass is not valid. Let's hammer this point home. The validity of a sacrament is, did the sacrament happen? When it comes to the case of the Mass, the Eucharist, is the bread and wine consecrated and turned into the body and blood of Jesus, body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus, or is it not? Yes, it is. No one is saying the new Mass is not valid. No one is saying when you go up to receive Holy Communion that you're not actually receiving Jesus.